Welcome to Secular Sankofa, the podcast of Association of Black Humanists, a space where we speak boldly, think freely, and live consciously. Here, we have an honest and unapologetic conversation about race, belief, and power and liberation from a Black and godless point of view. My name is Audrey Simmons and I'll be your host today. And on today's show, we are joined by someone who is a great friend and supporter of Association of Black Humanists, Mr. S.I.Martin. Welcome to you.
Good morning.
He is a British historian, a researcher of historical archives, and a teacher specialising in Black British history and literature. And I really want to thank you for joining us today. And I'm really looking forward to today's show, where we're going to be looking at views, kind of get your views and perspective on some of the issues that we are facing today, and to keep a watchful eye on what's going on in the future. And today's focus is taken from our name, Sankofa, which some of you may know means to go back and pick it up, or to use another way, to look at using our history to inform our future. And I think those are the kind of things that we want to discuss with you today as part of the show. Now, before we get to all of that, I think it would be a good way just to kind of, for people who don't know you, who don't know your work or anything about you, to kind of give a brief introduction to you, Steve.
Wow. How long have you got? Okay. So, I'm Steve Martin, but I publish and practice, I would say, under the name S.I.Martin, my initials, which were obviously given to me by my parents who arrived in these islands in the late 1950s from the island of Antigua. And they settled in the heart of England, in Bedford, a little market town, which has just gone a lot into my whole psychology, let's just say that. And it was an interesting upbringing. I think it was a good one, but it was infused with religion, a lot of it, a lot of straight up heavy Christianity. The local church, the local black church, was a Church of God in Christ, Kojic, part of the American franchise, which is what it is, which held the flock in absolute thrall. I mean, I could see the values of this institution. It was a place of meeting, of trying to make sense of the world, even if it was using nonsense. It was, in a sense, our nonsense to a little degree. It was a place of just community cohesion, but also a place of power where people, individuals, particularly men, could have some sort of authority, which was just not present in the world. And, they could shower themselves with all sorts of titles. And, of course, there was the portrait of the Nazarene, the white Christ, literally looking down on us, making sure that we were behaving ourselves, it just did not align with, my nascent, just common sense. What is that? But as I said, I was lucky. I did have a good childhood. And my dad, when I reached the age of 12 or 13, he actually offered us the choice. My brother and I were given the choice. I think he might have just been a doubter, a more serious doubter than he let on domestically. But he gave us a choice, and my brother and I, do we want to continue going to church regularly? And of course the answer was no. It made no sense at all. Not just philosophically, but energetically on a Sunday morning. Come on. So that wasn't going to happen. And from that point on, I just started exploring more, the world of basically skepticism, disbelief, and also the impact that these belief systems had on organized religion, particularly the big sky god religions, the catastrophic impact that it still has on communities of African origin.
Thank you for that. I think that image you created, I think it's the experience of many of us who come from the Caribbean or African community, of that kind of idea that when you're born, you come out of your mother's womb and you're shoved into the church, and that's where you are. We're not always given the option, though, to leave. So I think that is a very unique situation for you. Many of us had to keep going and struggle on until we were in our teens and, much older, until we could make those decisions ourselves, or were able to challenge them from as an adult. So I think, you're echoing, the Black community in a very clear way there. And you're someone that has facts and knowledge of history at their fingertips. You have that knowledge there. How does being someone who has looked at the archives, who's done all of that historical research, how does that shape the way that you approach the conversations about belief and disbelief today?
A lot, actually. It's about, for me in my practice, I'm all about developing a sense of ownership of archival material and examining evidence, but owning our own conclusions and developing our conclusions, particularly as people of African origin, that, we're stewards of all of this information. And it's our responsibility. It's not anyone else's responsibility to be doing these things for us. We can't or shouldn't outsource it. Why would we? Why would we invite other parties or entities to involve themselves in our own making? Also, I think we should have these body of narratives at the core of what we do. And when I say a body of narratives, I'm talking about, again, from my practice, looking at the stories of everyday people, looking at everyday successes, starting history from the bottom up. Because, we do have a particular history which involves a huge amount of overcoming. And because of that inordinate amount of overcoming and self-creation, it can often lend or open itself to the temptation of these fantastic and fabulous stories of gods and kings and heroes and prophets and mysticism. So I go back to front on that to say that our stories should start at the base level, that they're going from the bottom up, that they should be stories of everyday victories of everyday people under extraordinary circumstances. And because I'm hyper-local, I like to start from where I am or where the audience I'm talking to is. I'll be looking at stories of, let's say, ordinary black men and women who were living, say in or Huntingdon, who managed to live decent, respectable, conflicted, compromised lives. So, that we can actually properly stand on people's shoulders and, see ourselves in the round, faults and all, but love ourselves all the same without all these titles and honorifics and posturing. I don't know how to say it any other way.
And I think it's also about owning that narrative, that it's from us. And we can look at our ancestors and those in the back, and we can say, yeah, no, they were faulty, they were, you know what I mean? But they're ours, and we can create that narrative about them from our perspective. And a lot of the time, our stories, they're not even just changed, they're dismissed, they're erased.
Yes. Isn't this interesting? This discomfort that we have with these. And I think where the pain is, that's a lot of the pain and confusion and compromise. That's where a lot of the meat is. These are springboards to the future because, we have examples of what not to do rather than, people who are just abundantly and divinely blessed or who were, had unearned wealth or fortune. No, we come from something very, very important and very special, and we should treasure it.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. Also thinking about you as a humanist. As humanists, we try to emphasize and share share dignity and to remember our humanity, which has been, we have been, our humanity over the centuries has been sort of discarded, dismissed as non-existent. So how do you think history can be used not only to understand the past, as, that's what we do when we're thinking about the past, but also to build more compassionate and inclusive society in today's world?
Yeah, I think initially by looking for commonality. And, everything I'm doing is just trying to be going back to basics in some way or another, but looking for commonalities between individuals, between groups, between nations, looking for also examples of best practice, and if those examples can be transferred, or if not, why not? And looking, and that's the point I think I was trying to flag up earlier, looking at things in the round, trying to look at things, both the good and the bad, because that's something which I think often is lacking in our approach. And it has to as well be, again, based in justice. An idea of justice has to underpin what we do and the sorts of humanism that we take forward. And there's a bigger question as well, though, which, I'm still not perfectly answered, or I'm not comfortable with my current thinking on it. It's very incomplete, which is that is there a need for a very specific sort of African-based humanism or African culture, diasporic as well, humanism, and to what degree? How will that take shape? I'm inclined to say yes, but I don't know how that's going to take shape or what even the first steps could be towards that.
Do you know something, Steve? You raise something that's so, I mean, as Association of Black Humanists, this is the this is the very essence of what we grapple with all the time. We have this narrative and understanding of humanism. But I think, as with all kinds of philosophies, all kinds of ideas, it isn't a one size fits all.
Yeah.
And even if we look at religion, if we take Catholicism, if we take Irish Catholicism or Spanish, there's a cultural element to all of those things as well. Because if there wasn't, you couldn't take it on wholesale in the way that you do, because you have to be able to relate to it. And sometimes the European humanism, or the perspective of the European, doesn't always sit as neatly or manifest itself as coherently as someone who comes from the Caribbean would actually be able to relate to in quite the same way. We can take all of those bits, and then all of the bits of being kind and altruism and all of those things that we think about. But then we have to make them relatable. And you were talking about taking things locally. And I think humanism, we need to work at how we do that.
Yeah, it's difficult, I think, particularly because, we live in a diaspora, and we're part of a diaspora, I should say, including continental Africans. Incredibly diverse sets of backgrounds, origins, values. And I'm sort of worried about trying to water this complexity and diversity down into some essentialist, easily cloggable set of values. I think it's a big ask, but it's worth going for. But it's going to be a difficult journey, I think.
You were talking about being in a diaspora. We're also a people who are displaced from our communities, displaced from our history, displaced from, where we originally came from. And when we are in these spaces, we're in America, where we're in places where we don't look like the people around, the majority people, we're also homogenized in a way that even, and so our individuality. So we have this label of being Black because it's useful to kind of bring us together, but then it misses the individuality. It misses, the kind of what we do as individuals. So we're not labeled as Jamaicans or Nigerians, or even, we're not labeled in those ways. We're homogenized into this group, and we're supposed to act as one. And that can be difficult when we're looking at humanism, when we're looking at European humanism and all of those kinds of things. There is is there still a homogenistic way of European humanism? Is that still, although we think of it in that way, is that still the same thing?
No, I think, as you explained, why not? Because in your opening remarks here, because the Europeans, or Europeans globally, they do have the advantage of being the holders of capital, being, through the media, the creators of meaning, etc., etc. So it's totally different. My concern, obviously, we need to be greater creators of meaning and holders and creators of capital, but on a more basic level of fundamental values, unfortunately, there are all kinds of ridiculous diaspora wars still going on between us, real and rage bait diaspora wars. But it's overcoming those things in the reality of them, between behaviors and values, between people who live in, say, Handsworth to Tuscaloosa, Alabama, to Trinidad, to Kigali, doing that fusion in good faith.
And I suppose at the heart of all of this, as a Black people, we have the insertion of religion as well. So we're trying to find ourselves culturally in those different places, but we've got this insertion of something that's quite odd, that doesn't have anything to do with us. And we've suddenly, positioned it as the center of our worlds as well. And I find that a little strange, because we have to deal with something additional to do with our history, slavery, colonialization, and then the insertion of this Palestinian Jew and all that follow, and all that goes with that as well. And then try to create a people out of that, this heady mix of stuff.
Yeah, so I think it's catastrophic, and, we need to drop it like a hot brick right now, yesterday, because it can only take us so far. It can be said to have served a purpose when there was actual ongoing chattel slavery, when we had the value of a table or a piece of glassware. Probably less. So it could have served a purpose then. It could have given us hope beyond hope, when you couldn't see ourselves, imagine ourselves inhabiting a world outside of generationally being owned, quite literally. So yes, it has its place then as a sanctuary for the most desperate. But we're just not in those times now. And also, if you can read the Bible, then, you can read Chinua Achebe, you can read Marx, you can read, you have that mental mobility. So there's no excuse for not at least being skeptical, if not agnostic or straight up atheist. It's a luxury we can't afford.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I agree. Now, I know that you're used to, you've got your head in the archives, and that's where
I do.
you're comfortable. But I also know that you are in touch with what is going on today. You're there in what's happening today. And across Britain and beyond, we are seeing the rise of Christian nationalism, not only in the white community, but Black people are latching onto it as well. So what's your perspective? What parallels do you see from earlier moments when religion was fused with political power and identity?
Okay, so, well, just in terms of the UK, initially, well, we are still carrying collectively as citizens, subjects, really, of these islands, the legacy of that whole fusion between church and state, going back, wow, how far do you want to go back? To the 1000s, at least, the 11th century. You can see that, that from that point onwards, there were ecclesiastical courts, bishops and abbots who are massive landowners. I think they were the largest landowners in the country, were at the center of power. There's no difference. They sat, of course, as some still do, in Parliament, in the Lords. But yeah, at every state that, you want to look at, you can see, even under, obviously, Henry VIII, who goes as far as breaking from Rome, 1530s, and declaring himself the supreme head of the Church of England. Yeah, and of course, the current monarch is still, King Charles is still the supreme head of the Church of England. And they're followed by a period of religious conflicts domestically. You've got, under Mary, people being burnt at the stake. It's just crazy. And then the Civil War, it's basically, two types of Protestants, one official Anglican Protestants and one large. This is very, very broad, cartoonish terms, but I find it a cartoonish subject. And on the other hand, you've got nonconformists who, after the Restoration in 1660 become excluded by law from serving in the military, going to certain universities, particularly Oxford and Cambridge, and just other parts of public life. So, that's the background. There's a lot more, a lot more. So it's not a modern history. It's not nothing new at all. It's part and parcel of this island story. But coming to the present, I cannot take British Christian nationalism seriously at all. What are you talking about? British Christian nationalism. One of the things, if I believed in a deity, I would just say, well, it's the May weekend. I'll raise a glass to whatever pagan entity is still having some rulership over these islands, because there is just a great healthy, active, pagan sense of irreverence, which I think is the biggest barrier to the penetration of Christian nationalist ideas. If you're looking at the relationship of the modern Britain to the Christian faith in particular, no, that person will probably be someone from a visible minority background. Looks like you and me. We are keeping the church alive, including the Anglican Church, the Church of England as well. So I cannot see, especially, and I'm talking about clownishness, if Christian nationalism is being represented by Tommy Robinson and Father Calvin Robinson, with his mixed background self, and he's out there fronting and pushing Christian nationalist ideas, white Christian nationalist ideas, it won't get much traction. So I'm not really worried about Christian nationalism in the UK. But in the United States, 100%, because it is the last refuge of those, the racist wretches. That's a natural and inevitable home for them. I think that's a much bigger danger. But I can't see it as a philosophy spreading over here, but the racist foundations of it might do, or have done already. What am I talking about?
I was going to say, we have Farage, and he's always being touted as the next prime minister. That would affect everything, I think, or we can see what's happening with Project 25, and there's obviously the Project 26, and we can see what's happening with Trump. And we in Britain, we do look across the pond and start adopting. So I've been thinking about education and race relations and migration and all of the rights that we have fought for since, since we've been here. We've been fighting to, 1919 all the way up, just fighting,
Mhm.
fighting, fighting. It's been a constant fight to see all of those eroded, possibly in one term, maybe less. Is that not a consideration too?
It is a consideration, and I'm extremely concerned about the pressing possibility, I should say, of a Farage-led government. It will be catastrophic. But, we have to really play this one very, very sensibly in terms of not just our own, some of us are going to participate in the foolishness, but also, you were mentioning that erosion of human rights. And I'm, in fact, more immediately concerned with, again, the religious participation in the erosion of human rights, which is, here I have to include Islam as well as fundamentalist Christianity. Fundamentalist Islam as well as fundamental Christianity. Both of those expressions in Britain they have black faces. I'm trying to find a euphemism. They have non-white faces. So, non-European peoples are, the poster children for extremist Islam and Christianity in Britain. And they are very connected to, or very vocal about pushing back all kinds of human rights, euthanasia, women's rights, LGBT rights, prayer in school, religious worship, and the prominence in education, formal education. Everybody's educated. Now, we need to really watch ourselves in that respect because, it's along that particular fault line that, religion and race, it puts us on the back foot because, people can actually say that, are we enemies of progress in that regard? It's arguably, yes. And that can be weaponized against us, or we'll weaponize it against ourselves.
Thank you for that. I think it's a really interesting point that we actually become our own worst enemies in
Mhm.
terms of thinking about who are the proponents of. I mean, I think of, I'm going to say her name, and I apologize for now for saying and mentioning the name of, Kemi Badenoch, and because we want to have that close relationship to the British elite and all of that, and I think we perpetuated this by sending, because the educational system, the base state education system was so bad. A lot of parents decided that the private sector was the way to go.
Mhm.
And what that produced was people who thought like,
Mhm.
Boris Johnson. But now we have the black version of that. And
Mhm.
that is where we are at the moment in trying to help our children and giving them that leg up in society. We've
Mhm.
created another group of people who are, who don't see themselves as being related to us in a way.
Yeah, interesting, because I am a product of those processes you've described. Like you say, we are all, those of us who went through those processes, survivors of those experiences, one way or another. But that underpinning that is that drive, the compulsion to align ourselves with authority that, we don't see in the world. One description of a lot of our religious communities is like, we are authoritarians without any authority. So we will align ourselves with status symbols and authority and seek that proximity to power, or create parodies or parallels or parodies of that power. It's always going to be there. But you're right about the much maligned and misunderstood Kerry Badenoch. She is a wonderful example of that. I know there's so many ways that we can make a mess of the next 10 to 15 years, but it all seems to converge amongst us along the same things. How do we describe ourselves as individuals and as groups within nations and globally? We need to get about that now, rather than looking for places in anyone's shadow cabinet.
Thinking about that, so now you and I are of a certain generation, they're kind of the last of that kind of Windrush generation. You've got a new generation now. And many young people, Caribbean people, African people of African heritage, are searching for belonging, are still searching for identity because of this mixed up history that we've had. Whilst they are moving away from mainstream, from mainstream religion, group of people who are doing that, they seem to be moving towards this African spirituality that seems to be taking hold. There's this idea of going back to before slavery, and somehow that's where we will find ourselves. What are your thoughts on that? Is spirituality better than mainstream religion?
Well, I don't know what to tell you. I don't know how to express what I'm feeling. Okay, ultimately, I don't know. And I have to say, just to be charitable, I can't say if it's better or not. But personally, I think it's preferable. And that, the caveat for me is that, I believe it's nonsense. A lot of the spiritualities that I've seen, some of them like Ifa, some of its divination procedures, they're quite interesting, but that doesn't make them true. But some of the expressions of those belief systems, no, I've got very little time for them personally. However, I think it being nonsense, as I said before, it's our nonsense. And it has some root, some grounding in the experiences of some of our peoples or some of our ethnic groups. So it just has that great sense of ownership. And I'm not going to say belonging because I don't believe in them. I don't think they're real. But there's just a greater sense of ownership and freedom to criticize in those things as well, because we're still far too much in the thrall of these big sky desert god religions. But I do think, and I'm love to see that there is some pushback against established, those established religions. And I think it's a good and very, very welcome thing.
Yeah, I also think it's something to do with trying to carve a way that was ours. And I think
Hmm.
I always wonder who would then, what is now Nigeria or South Africa or Mali or Rwanda, what kind of people would we have been if there hadn't been this interruption of slavery, colonialism and religion? How would we have formed ourselves based on those religious, those kinds of spiritual, that kind of the African religions that were already there? Where would we have gone? Because we may have ditched them, but what would we have created, or what kind of societies we would have created? And I think there's this yearning to know who could we have been without this interruption, insertion.
Yes, I mean, it dreams of Wakanda. We want to know that. And it's both pathetic and beautiful at the same time, and absolutely necessary to keep those visions in mind, because it seems obvious to me that the belief systems that we would have had, again, would have been our own. We'd have had that sense of, stewardship over them and even being, answerable to them for what that's worth. But it would be just a sense of looking to ourselves to a greater degree, for right or for wrong, but just looking to ourselves and having that sense of responsibility rather than having literally our heart in Mecca or Jerusalem, or even more worryingly, in Washington, D.C. with Donald Trump, who is for a lot of people their Lord and Savior. Again, looking for that aligning with power, aligning with authority, all of that sort of thing. So I've lost my thread there of what I was replying to, because, where we would have been. Yeah, we would have had a more continental African-based center, point of reference, rather than have an external, the psychologists call it something I'm going to forget, an external locus of control. Yeah. So we would have had an internal locus of control, whereas we could feel a greater sense of responsibility for ourselves and for our future, rather than being at the mercy of the World Health Authority or the IMF, or failing them, spirits and demons and ghosts and curses and prophecies, or the white man, or coming to a country near you, the Indian or the Chinese. It would be about us. We'd be our first and principal point of reference. And I think that changes everything.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. I'm just kind of thinking about, what we have learnt and what we know about the past. So what would be some of the things that we know about the past that we can kind of go, let's grab this, grab that, and use it now in our future, the lessons that we learned, or, what can we bring to the future to encourage and support and take us forward as we go forward now?
Yeah, well, first and foremost, and again, this is a part of my practice, the cultivation of young people and the belief and faith in young people, because a lot of my work looks at the lives of young people, particularly in the British Isles, but also in the Caribbean and North America and continental Africa, who are making extraordinary decisions and who are possessed with the ingenuity and passion and foresight to see things through. I'm just tapping into that human potential, which is a thing that absolutely fascinates me. And we're losing, it's a whole other conversation, down to AI and just being comfortably dumb. But all of those things to do with memory, to do with mathematical, just mental maths, to do with mapping, which can be transferred infinitely into other zones, including making relationships. But yes, it would be investing in young people, investing in the future, because they have the power to change things, because they can, with our help, change themselves and us.
Wonderful. I'm just thinking now, although I know we are British based, but we have a lot of people from the African diaspora who are here in the UK. You know, as Association of Black Humanists, we know that there are a lot of young people out there, or people in general, who would like to leave religion and just, you know, be themselves. What kind of pressures do you think stops them from doing that? What kind of things do you think are happening?
Pressures for people of continental African background a lot and hard. I mean, we don't have to look far at all to see just the conversation we're having now. That would be categorized by many believers as not just blasphemy, but actually insanity. Look at Mubarak Bala. You know, he spent a lot of his time imprisoned for blasphemy in a psychiatric ward. I'm actually lost for words, but that is it. It's a sense of exclusion, which is almost unimaginable. So, and, you know, to not be a part of that society, to have to go outside of it, or to go so deeply and alonely isn't the word, but solely into oneself to create your own comfort. It's, especially for young people, it's a terrifying, disturbing journey. But I'm glad to say, again, always trust the young people. They are doing it, and they are doing it with such style, such class, such elan and fervor and wit and warmth. It just brings me joy to see, you know, the new generation, particularly this generation of African young skeptics, unbelievers. I don't know if I just spend too much online, but I do get the impression that it's growing, of course, not growing fast enough for my comfort, but it appears to be growing and becoming a force to be reckoned with. And it's getting mainstream attention, which it would never have got, I would say, even 10 years ago.
And that was going to be my next question about the online platform, the TikTokers and all of these. Is that the future? Is that where we're going? Is that how we are going to be able to kind of progress our message?
Yes, I think so for the time being, because it's second nature to, the generation born in this century, the generations born in this century. It's second nature to them, which is both sad and glorious as well. But to seek community of some sort online and to have that extended and potentially global as well area of fellowship and collective meaning. So I've got my issues with those platforms and formats, but for a first step, getting voices like Queen Erin I, incredible unbeliever, who is learned as well, very, very learned, deeply steeped in this, but so funny. And, you know, who can just push that message without having anyone over her shoulder. Serafina Simone, that Igbo boy, all of them are very, very powerful voices with huge audiences. The future, or at least the present, offers some hope.
And that's good to know. I think that's, and I suppose, but I kind of wonder, so we've got this platform of Black people, of young Black people putting their voices out there. And I just wonder, again, we were talking about that cultural aspect of it. Do you think that will be lost, even though they're African, because when you've got this kind of space that is neutral or just, it's just individuals, that collective voice, when we think of Ubuntu, when we think of that collective voice, do you think that will get lost?
I fear that it might, or even worse than just that getting lost, bad as that would be, its replacement by this sort of like global, English-speaking, middle-class, neutered, overly American point of reference universe, which is sellable, which is accessible, which will become a sort of lingua franca for young people nowadays. And that could happen. That would not be good.
Yeah, because in this popularist soundbite,
Yeah.
you know what I mean? 10, what is it? We've got 60 seconds to kind of get our thoughts across and a little bit more. We then have to pick the juiciest, most salient, or just those little bits to fire at people. And we lose, and I think we can see that now, the nuance. And you were talking about history being complicated. It isn't just about heroes. It's heroes with all the sticky bits that go with them. And I think we can end up with this kind of mushy, bland, beige kind of humanism or non-belief that doesn't represent anything really, doesn't really kind of
Yeah.
say anything.
There will be some of that anyway. It's just a matter of somehow being alive and being awake to the need just to keep that tamped down, or at least keep an eye on it, because it will come. But still, I think it's a good step forward, and a lot more positives can come out of it than negatives.
Okay, yeah, we can just live in hope, fingers crossed, as I say. Just thinking sort of bigger there, thinking about what institutions and the conversations and cultural shifts do you think will shape the future? Of non-belief? Where were those kind of new external voices going to come from?
God, I don't know. I don't know. And that's where I fear. Maybe I'm scared to think about that question, Audrey, because I worry that any new institution, because I can't think of anything that we have now which is fit for purpose, but not off the top of my head. But I worry that any new body which can, get to work on this stuff might start imitating sort of religious behaviors and patterns and forms and demands of people, even if it's just having formalized dress or some sort of fixed body of text. I'm just worried that not religion, but the religious exoskeleton might creep in by another door, masquerading as progressivism. I don't know. Maybe I think too much about this.
I think you've got a point. I mean, I used to be a humanist wedding celebrant. And that opens up the door. You can do anything you want with this. I come along and I'd say, do anything you want. The words you. And what everybody did was just create the standard wedding without the God bit. So they'd have vows and all of these things. And some would throw in a little rope, sort of hand tying or sand or something, a mixing of sands. And there would be a little thing, and there was a little love cup and things like that would turn up, you know what I mean, to kind of be a little bit woo. But the format became very much the standard.
Yes.
Recognized format of what a wedding should be. So even with, when you have too much choice or the idea of just doing something where, hey, no one wanted to do it. Everyone was comfortable.
Yes.
And, in this kind of idea was, we won't say God, we won't say any of the things, won't read scripture, but the format will stay the same. So I hear what you're saying, that we'll just take, standard stuff that we all recognize and then just overlay it.
Yes.
With, something that's non-religious. And I think that's what religion did in the first place. It took pagan holidays, pagan festivals, and then just overlaid it with religion. So we could just repeat that pattern.
Yes, that's something I worry about. At least there's more flexibility with paganism, some cold comfort. There's some flexibility with paganism if we have to.
Before we go, I want to bring it on to a positive note. What gives you hope? What gives Steve hope for the future of the Black community and, its non-religious pathway?
Well, I mean, I'm back to my cliche. The young people, and they get too much of a bad rap. Obviously, there are things that need to be addressed, but the spread of ideas, the openness emotionally that they display, also the understanding of that they are part of a diaspora, which I think, apart from some parts of North American culture, it's pretty broad spread and just generally accepted. There are problems with that, but it's still there. So I think those little steps, and they're not little steps at all, but particularly the openness about our own individual and collective experiences and the discussions that, are being had around them are a great step forward. Yeah, an increase in skepticism, but everything's to do with the younger generations who in many ways are our youngers and betters.
And on that note, Steve, I think we'll call it Ade, I want to thank you so much for the conversation.
My
It
pleasure.
really was a joy, and just to kind of get your perspective and have this discussion. So if you've enjoyed today's episode, please follow us wherever you get your podcasts. And don't forget to share and like and tell your friends. And follow Association of Black Humanists on Meetup. You'll find out what we're doing, what activities we're at, and where we're meeting. This has been Secular Sankofa. Until the next time, speak boldly, think freely, and live consciously. I've been your host, Audrey Simmons. Until the next time.